Narcissists believe they read people better than anyone else. It is one of the foundational assumptions their entire behavioral system is built on. So when they realize they completely misread someone, what happens next reveals something about their psychology that they spend their entire lives making sure no one ever gets to see. There is a process that happens at the beginning of every relationship a narcissist enters that most people never identify as a process because it happens quickly, operates beneath the surface of the apparent warmth and attention of early contact, and produces no visible evidence of its own occurrence. The target assessment within the earliest interactions. The narcissist system is running an evaluation, not of the person in front of them, as a full human being with depth, complexity, and interior resources that will only reveal themselves across time and circumstance, but of their exploitability, their emotional availability, their attachment patterns, their specific vulnerabilities to the approaches the narcissist has found most effective with similar profiles, their likely tolerance threshold, and the conditions under which that threshold can be managed. What most people don't realize is that this assessment is genuinely rapid, and its speed is also its primary weakness. Because a rapid assessment of a complex person, conducted through the narrow lens of exploitability rather than genuine curiosity, will systematically miss everything about that person that doesn't present itself immediately as relevant to the extraction process. The target's actual capabilities, their depth of perception, their capacity for strategic patience, the specific psychological resources they have access to that aren't visible in the initial presentation of warmth, openness, and apparent emotional availability. Pay attention to what this systematic oversight produces over time, because the narcissist, having built their entire approach to the relationship on a fundamentally incomplete picture of who they are dealing with, has been operating under a set of assumptions that reality was always eventually going to challenge. This is where the competence detection delay reveals its significance, because the narcissist's attention during the relationship was never directed at understanding the target. It was directed at managing them, and management doesn't require understanding. It requires only sufficient knowledge of what levers produce what responses. The target's actual interior, their genuine capabilities, their real psychological depth, their true capacity for observation and strategic awareness, was never the focus of the narcissist's attention, which means it was always the dimension of the target that the narcissist was least prepared for when it finally became visible. Most people miss this warning sign because the narcissist's apparent attentiveness in the early relationship looks like genuine interest in who the person is. The hidden reason it consistently fails to produce accurate assessment is that it was never actually interested in that question. There is a specific moment when the narcissist's misassessment of a target becomes impossible to maintain, and it rarely arrives gradually. It arrives as a collision, a specific encounter with evidence so thoroughly incompatible with the operating model that the model cannot absorb it through the usual revision processes of minimization, reframing, or selective attention. The moment of recognition, what most people don't realize is that this moment is not experienced by the narcissist as a correction to their understanding. It is experienced as a disruption, a sudden jarring encounter with a version of the person they believed they had thoroughly mapped that bears almost no resemblance to the map they were operating from. The target demonstrates a capability the narcissist didn't know they possessed. They respond to a manipulation attempt with a clarity that suggests they saw it coming before it arrived. They make a decision, take an action, or produce an outcome that simply could not have been generated by the psychologically diminished, easily managed person the narcissist's assessment had concluded they were dealing with. Pay attention to what this produces in the narcissist's immediate behavioral response, because the response is the recognition's most visible symptom. A pause where there was never a pause before, a recalibration visible in the slight shift of approach that follows the failed tactic, a quality of attention that is different in character from the monitoring attention, the narcissist maintained throughout the relationship. Sharper, more wary, carrying the specific alertness of someone who has just discovered that the environment they were navigating contained something they failed to account for. Most people miss this warning sign because it is brief. The narcissist system moves quickly to contain the disruption, generating explanations, reframings, alternative accounts of what just happened that attempt to incorporate the new evidence without requiring a fundamental revision of the operating model. But this is where the retroactive threat assessment begins, and it is the part of the recognition moment that produces the most significant internal disruption, because it cannot be managed through ordinary reframing. The narcissist system, having registered that the target was not who the assessment concluded, immediately begins reviewing the relationship's history through the lens of this new information. Every interaction gets recalculated. Every moment where the target appeared to comply gets re-examined for evidence of what was actually happening beneath the compliance. Every instance where the narcissist believed they were successfully managing the dynamic gets reassessed in light of the possibility that the management was permitted rather than achieved. The hidden reason this retroactive review is so unsettling to the narcissist system is the specific question it keeps arriving at. One that the narcissist's belief in their own superior perception makes almost intolerable to genuinely consider. How much of what I thought was control was actually being allowed? There is a structural requirement of the narcissistic personality that most people never identify as a requirement, because it doesn't announce itself as a need, doesn't present as a vulnerability, and is so thoroughly embedded in the narcissist's fundamental orientation toward relationships that it appears to be simply the way things are, rather than a dependency that could be threatened. The requirement of positional superiority. In the narcissist relational world, every dynamic has a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is never genuinely in question. The narcissist occupies the superior position not as a conclusion that requires ongoing evidence to support, but as a premise that organizes every other aspect of the interaction. Other people are assessed relative to this premise, their capabilities evaluated through a lens that consistently produces conclusions compatible with the narcissist's superior positioning. And contradictory evidence gets processed through revision mechanisms designed to protect the premise rather than update it. What most people don't realize is how completely this structural requirement shapes the narcissist's initial assessment of targets. A person is selected, in part because the initial assessment concludes that they occupy a subordinate position in the relevant hierarchy, that their psychological resources, social capabilities, and self-awareness are sufficiently limited to make the superior positioning stable and sustainable. When the realization arrives that this conclusion was wrong, that the person assessed as subordinate was never actually subordinate, the disruption this produces is not simply about having made an error in judgment. It is about having organized an entire relational dynamic around a hierarchical premise that was false from the beginning. Pay attention to what this power redistribution shock does to the narcissist's behavioral system, because it produces something that most people never expect to see from a personality that projects such consistent certainty. Disorientation. Visible, behavioral, poorly managed disorientation. The narcissist, who has always known their position in every relational hierarchy, suddenly finds themselves in a dynamic where the hierarchy they assumed is not the one that actually existed. And the response this produces reveals, more clearly than anything that preceded it in the relationship, that the certainty was always more performance than reality. This is where the behavioral overcorrection arrives, and it is one of the most diagnostically revealing behavioral sequences in the entire dynamic, because its specific form communicates information about the narcissist's internal state that the overcorrection itself was attempting to conceal. Most people miss this warning sign because the overcorrection looks like one of two things, neither of which appears on its surface. to be evidence of panic. It looks like escalation or it looks like accommodation. Two completely different behavioral presentations that are beneath their surface differences, expressions of the same internal disruption. The escalation is the system attempting to force the hierarchy back into its assumed configuration through increased pressure. The accommodation is the system attempting to reposition relative to a target whose actual capabilities have now been registered, adjusting the approach to account for a threat level the original assessment never anticipated. Both are responses to the same recognition. Both reveal the same thing about what the original assessment was built on. There is an emergency that the narcissist faces when the recognition of having underestimated someone extends beyond the immediate relational dynamic and reaches into the social infrastructure that surrounds it. Because the story the narcissist told about this person was never confined to their own internal assessment. It was distributed. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist narrative about their target was circulating in the social environment from very early in the relationship, communicated to mutual contacts, to new supply sources, to the broader social network in which both parties existed. The story was consistent with the misassessment. It positioned the target in the subordinate, less capable, less psychologically sophisticated role that the narcissist's internal hierarchy required. It may have included characterizations of the target's emotional instability, their dependence, their limitations, all derived from an assessment that has now been revealed as fundamentally wrong. The narrative revision emergency arrives when the narcissist recognizes that this story, already distributed and partially established in the minds of mutual contacts, is now at risk of collision with a version of the target that those same contacts are beginning to observe directly, a version that contradicts the narrative with the simple, irrefutable evidence of visible capability. Pay attention to what the narcissist does in response to this collision risk, because the behavior it produces is among the most revealing in the entire post-recognition sequence. The narrative doesn't simply get quietly revised. It gets aggressively managed, the characterizations of the target intensified rather than softened. The story about their limitations doubled down on rather than walked back. The social positioning accelerated rather than paused. Most people miss this warning sign because the intensification of the smear campaign after a recognition event looks, from the outside, like ordinary narcissistic behavior. The hidden reason it intensifies specifically at this moment reveals something about its function that ordinary smear campaigns don't fully expose. It is not simply about damaging the target. It is about protecting the assessment, because if the assessment was wrong, the judgment that produced it was fallible. And fallible judgment in the narcissist's self-concept is not a characteristic they can incorporate without threatening the foundational premise of their own superiority. This is where the re-engagement recalibration reveals the recognition's most operationally significant consequence. Because the narcissist who has underestimated someone and lost them, whether through the target's departure or through the dynamic's fundamental restructuring, now faces a re-engagement challenge that their system is poorly equipped to meet. The tactics were calibrated to the wrong person. The vulnerabilities that were mapped don't belong to the person the target turned out to be. The approaches that were designed to produce specific responses were designed for a psychological profile that was always more the narcissist's projection than the target's reality. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's re-engagement attempts following a recognition event have a different quality from their ordinary hoovering. More tentative, more probing, less certain of their own effectiveness. Because the system that generates re-engagement tactics requires an accurate model of the target to calibrate against. And the model that was being used has just been revealed as inaccurate in ways the system doesn't yet know how to correct. Pay attention to what this tactical uncertainty looks like in practice, because it produces something the narcissist's behavior rarely displays in any other context. Hesitation, the slight pause before deploying an approach that used to be deployed with complete confidence. The modified version of a previously reliable tactic that has been adjusted in ways that reveal uncertainty about whether the original version will still work. The shift between multiple approaches in rapid succession that communicates the absence of confidence in any single one. The hidden reason this hesitation is so significant is not what it reveals about the specific re-engagement attempt. It is what it reveals about the foundational assumption the entire relationship was built on. The narcissist's confidence in their ability to read, predict, and manage this person was always the premise from which every tactic was derived. And that premise has been permanently compromised, not by confrontation, not by argument, simply by the target being more than the assessment concluded they were. There is a shift that occurs in the narcissist psychology when the recognition of having underestimated someone reaches a depth sufficient to require not just tactical adjustment, but categorical revision. And this shift produces a quality of behavioral response that is qualitatively different from anything that preceded it in the relationship. The target stops being experienced as a supply source and starts being experienced as something closer to a rival. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's relational categories are limited and rigid. People are supply, sources, threats, or irrelevancies. And the movement of a person from one category to another produces a corresponding shift in the behavioral protocols the narcissist deploys toward them. A target who was assessed as a supply source and managed accordingly gets handled with the specific combination of idealization, conditioning, and devaluation that supply management requires. A target who is recategorized as a competitive threat gets handled with something entirely different. The competitive activation that follows the recognition of underestimation produces behaviors that most people, accustomed to the supply management dynamic, find genuinely confusing because they don't resemble the manipulation patterns that characterize the earlier relationship. They resemble, instead, the behaviors the narcissist directs at people they experience as genuine rivals, monitoring of the target's achievements and social standing, comparison of the target's perceived status to their own with an urgency and frequency that reveals discomfort, attempts to undermine the target's credibility, success, or social positioning that have a different quality from ordinary devaluation. More targeted, more specifically, aimed at the dimensions where the target's capabilities were demonstrated. Pay attention to what this competitive activation reveals about the recognition's depth, because the shift from supply management to competitive threat management only occurs when the narcissist system has registered the target's capabilities as genuinely significant. Most people miss this warning sign because they were never told that being recategorized as a threat by a narcissist is in the narcissist's internal hierarchy a higher category than supply source. This is where the irreversible status update completes the recognition's most lasting consequence. Because once a person has been recategorized, once the narcissist's internal model of them has been updated to reflect capabilities that the original assessment missed, the update cannot be reversed through the narcissist's ordinary narrative management processes. The hidden reason this irreversibility matters is structural. The narcissist's management of supply sources depends on maintaining a specific internal model of those sources, one that supports the hierarchical premise of the narcissist's superiority. A model that has been updated to reflect genuine capability in the target cannot easily be returned to the subordinate. Supply source configuration without contradicting evidence that the system now holds and cannot fully discard. The target in the narcissist's internal world has permanently become someone different from the person the relationship was originally organized around, and the behavioral consequence of that permanent revision will shape every subsequent interaction the narcissist initiates, whether or not they ever directly acknowledge that the original assessment was wrong. The encounter with someone who was always more than the assessment concluded. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's belief in their superior ability to read people is not simply an ego preference. It is a functional requirement, The foundational premise from which every tactic, every approach, every confident deployment of the manipulation toolkit is derived. And when that premise is revealed as having been wrong about a specific person, the disruption extends beyond the individual relationship into the narcissist's relationship with their own judgment. The target didn't have to confront the narcissist to produce this disruption. They didn't have to argue, expose, or retaliate. They simply had to be consistently and completely more than the narcissist's assessment concluded they were, and that quiet, behavioral, and entirely beyond the narcissist's ability to manage or reframe was always the most disruptive thing they could have been.